Good morning and welcome. Hope you guys are doing well. Today we are going to talk about the usage of different lenses in terms of focal length. Beginners especially always want to know what focal length should they purchase. So here goes. If you are into landscape photography, generally I would recommend wide angle lenses. But there are several wide angle lenses. So if you are a beginner, my suggestion is to either get a 35 millimeter or a 28 millimeter. Why not wider? I'll tell you why. Unless you are very careful, unless you level your camera properly, you are going to have distortions. If you tilt your camera down or tilt it up or tilt it sideways, you are likely to get a lot of distortion. Of course, distortion would also be there with a 28 or a 35, but it will be less. So for a beginner, 35 or 28 mm is the recommended focal length. This does not mean I would never use a telephoto lens. For example, if I want to isolate a subject within my landscape, I might use even a 200 or even a 300 lens. But for general photography, we use wide angle lenses since they cover a wider vista. What about macro photography? Well, if you are into macro, the best thing is to buy a macro lens, a dedicated macro lens which will focus up to 1:1 magnification. That means life size. If you cannot afford the macro lens, then there are solutions available. One of the solution is to get close-up filters, and you just attach it to whichever lens you are using. It allows you to focus closer. There are different filters available for close-ups. They are known as diopters, diopter 1 up to diopter 10. Again, my suggestion is try not to go beyond diopter 4 because focusing will be very critical. The depth of field will be very marginal and you may not be very happy with your final result. Another advantage of a macro lens over attaching the close-up filters to your ordinary lens is that if you suddenly want to shoot a faraway subject, with a macro lens you can just turn the focusing ring and do it. If you are using the close-up filters attached to your other lens, then you would have to first remove the filters before you can focus to infinity. What about wildlife? There are lots of people who love wildlife. Yes, that's true. For a wildlife, there is a variety of lenses available. But remember, whichever or whatever focal length you get for wildlife is likely to be not enough. When I started, it was 300 mm that we were using. Then came 400. 400 we felt is not enough. So 500, 600. Now at times we find even 600 is not enough. Because if you want to photograph, say, a bird is comparatively smaller than mammals. And if the bird is far away, even a 600 millimeter may not be adequate. So, for wildlife photography, try and get the longest possible lens for your kind of work. If you are photographing mammals and not birds, even a 400 millimeter or 500 millimeter is sufficient. For birds, even an 800 millimeters, as I said earlier, may not be sufficient. What about tabletops? In tabletops, you can use from wide angle all the way up to medium telephoto. But will not the wide angle cause some distortion if you go close? Yes, it will. But there are tabletops where you intentionally have a bit of distortion in the foreground to emphasize that area. So you could, for example, use a 35 millimeter, 24 or even 28 millimeter and go all the way up to 135, 180 or even 200. It depends on your requirement. What about fashion photography? Oh yeah, for fashion photography, I would suggest a lens like the 24-70 mm zoom or a 24-105 because it's very easy to change the focal length to compose or frame your subject better. What about interiors and architecture? Well, once again we go to wide angle lenses. Wide angle lenses will help you to take photographs in cramped up spaces and also for interiors and also for architecture. Just keep in mind that your camera should be leveled and not tilted, otherwise you are going to get distortion. What about sports or photojournalism? All right. In sports and photojournalism, let's take sports first. For sports, generally you would require a medium to long telephoto lens depending on what kind of sport you are photographing. If you are photographing cricket, for example, you might require a 500-600 millimeter lens or even longer. But if you are photographing indoor sports, then depending on how close you are to the subject, you could be using a 70 mm, 100 mm, or even probably a normal 50 millimeter or even a bit wider. But for photojournalism, the normal suggested lens is anywhere between 28 to 135. Now, mind you, these are just examples. This does not mean that you cannot use any other lens. You may prefer to use another lens, and that's fine. Now, next time I will talk about fast lenses and slow lenses and how they relate to photography in general. Till then, have a nice day. Adios.